9/11, one of the most tragic things that ever happened to Chile by the fascist American government who wanted to overthrow the first democratically elected Marxist president in the Western Hemisphere. Not in history, that belongs to India. If you want what happened, this is where neoliberalism was born. Even though the 1970s, we met the material preconditions to become a sci-fi level civilization, but the 70s, starting with the fascist dictatorship of Pinochet, by which the US government put it in charge, and the birth of neoliberalism, the rise of anti-intellectualism, especially in China during the Cultural Revolution, the rise of the conservative revolution, the rise of the anti-nuclear movement, and also the early anti-science that would eventually become the quote-unquote science wars, and all in the 70s, despite we met the precondition to move beyond our current society, and we've been in a technological, intellectual stagnation for the past 50 years. Like in more recent cases of Fascist Chile, free market capitalism was imposed on the majority of society by an elite using authoritarian state, starting by September 11, 1973. Although when they used the wealth of nations in this most orthodox approach to make Chile what it was during the 70s and 80s, this was recognized by Adam Smith when he opposed state intervention in the wealth of nations. In Smith's day, the government was openly and unashamedly an instrument of wealth owners. Less than 10% of British men, and no women by the way, had the right to vote. When Smith opposed state intervention, he was opposing the imposition of wealth owners' interests on everybody else. And this is how liberals, never mind the right-wing libertarians, is a political system which the many follow the rules and laws of, set down in the so-called interests of all by the few. As history shows, any minority giver or who take such power will abuse it in their own interest. Today, the situation is reversed with neoliberals and right libertarians opposing state intervention in the economy and the regulation of big businesses as to prevent public from having even a minor impact on the power of the interests of the elite. In the words of Henry Kissinger, he helped the military coup in Chile because he didn't want a communist nation in Chile because, and I quote, due to the stupidity of its own people. And even China, during the Maoist era, supported the dictatorship of Pinochet in Chile, where they even privatized social security. And this is why we have to reject the welfare state because it's just a giant con. There is no socialization for the people to decide what is best for each of their respective communities. Even if we commission costs were lowered by regulation, the impressive returns of capital seen from between 1982 to 1995, where the real annual return on investment average of 12.7%, are likely not to be sustained. These average returns coincide with the boom years in Chile, complemented by the government high borrowing costs because of the debt crisis in the 1980s. Latin governments were paying double-digit real interest rates in their bonds and the main investment vehicle of Social Security funds. In effect, government was subsidizing the private system by paying astronomical rates on the government bonds. Another failure of their system is that only a little over half of Chilean workers make regular Social Security contribution. While many believe the private system will reduce evasion because workers have greater necessity to contribute their own personal retirement accounts, 43.4% of those affiliated with the new system on June of 1995 did not contribute to the regular. And despite who decided to privatize Social Security in Chile, and especially other places in the world that came after, we find similar disappointing results. Seemingly, Chile's private system achieved impressive average return on investment. However, once commission are factored in, the real return of individual workers is considerably lower. For example, although the average rate of return of funds from 1982 through 1986 was 15.9%, The real return after commission was a mere 0.3% between 1991 to 1995. The pre-commission return was 12.9%, but the commission fell to 2.1%. According to Doug Heckworth in his book Wall Street, if the competing mutual funds have vast sales forces and the portfolio managers all have their vast fees, all in all administrative costs are almost 30% of revenue compared to well under 1% of the US Social Security system. In addition, the private pension funds market is dominated by the handful of companies and controlled by the elite. And there's a reason we have to reject voting as a means to make systematic change, because no amount of electoralists or reformists change. We need a revolutionary propaganda of the de-illegalist approach. Because, like we see in Chile, during the military coup against the democratically re-elected left-wing Allende government by the military, aided by the CIA, US-based corporations, and the US government to make it harder for the Allende regime. The coup resulted in thousands murdered and years of terror and dictatorship. By the danger of the pro-labor government was ended and the business environment was made wealthy for profits. An extreme example we know, but an important one for any believer in freedom or the idea that the state machine is somehow neutral and can be captured and used by left-wing parties, particularly as the fate of Chile has been suffered by many other reformist governments across the world. As one example from A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, and I quote, "Congressional committees began investigating of the FBI and CIA. The CIA inquiry disclosed that the CIA had gone beyond its original mission of gathering intelligence and was conducting secret operations of all kinds. For example, the CIA, with the coalition of the Secret Committee of 40 headed by Henry Kissinger, had worked to destabilize the democratically elected left-wing Chilean governor Salvador Allende. The investigation of the FBI disclosed many years of illegal action to disrupt and destroy radical groups and left-wing groups of all kinds. The FBI has sent forged letters, engaged in burglary, openly mailed illegally, and in case of Black Panther leader Frank Hampton, seen to have conspired in murder. The investigation themselves revealed the limits of government willingness to probe into such activities, and they submitted its findings of the CIA to the CIA to see if there was any material the agency wanted to omit it. And while classical liberals today and right-wing libertarians, and even to a lesser extent, like a very, very small majority of anarcho-capitalists, who try to defend the fascist Pinochet Chile as economic freedom, and somehow hardcore, pure, laissez-faire, raw, late-stage capitalism somehow works. But surely just Chile proves that economic freedom creates political freedom? Let's find out. It's not about este, Friedman defended his praise for Pinochet, Martin Friedman praised for Pinochet regime by arguing his economic freedom and how to produce an end of the dictatorship. It's hard to find any account to score by ideological blindness as this. The notion that Chile's free market capitalism provide the base for eliminating Pinochet's dictatorship is hard to defend. If it were true, what we would expect Pinochet's rule to be substantially shorter than any other military dictatorship in the region. However, this is not the case. For example, Argentina's military junta lasted from 1973 to 1983, that's 7 years. Peru is 12 years from 1968 to 1980. Uruguay is 12 years from 1973 to 1985. Bolivia was 18 years from 1964 to 1982. And Pinochet lasted for 17 years. Succeeded by Brazil's 21 years, 1964 to 1985. And Martin Friedman argued were valid, then Pinochet would have fallen along with the rest. In fact, Chile is one of the last Latin American countries to return to democracy. Nor can be said that ending of the Pinochet regime was automatic outcome of economic forces. Rather, it was a product of struggle by ordinary people who took to the street in the early 80s to protest in the face of state oppression. Regime was subject to popular pressure from below, and these, not capitalism, were the key factor. After all, it was not economic freedom which produced the desire for political freedom. Working class people could remember that political freedom was before it was destroyed in order to create the economic liberty by the right-wing libertarians and try to recreate it. And it was the anarchist tactics of bottom-up, decentralized, horizontal direct action of self-management, autonomy, and free association as the reason the dictatorship fall to begin with. In the face of state terror, political activists and trade unionists fought the regime. The 1988 referendum, freedom or lose, was the product of this heroic activity, not some abstract economic force. As Katie Skitscher points out, the 1983 to 86 cycles of protests had to set the stage for the negotiated transition to democracy in 1990. These protests, it should be noted, were subject to extreme state oppression. One demonstration saw Pinochet send 18,000 troops onto the streets, who shot 129 people, 29 died, and tortured some of the 1,000 residents. Peter Wynne, for example, noted the resistance of the workers to both the dictatorship and his neoliberal policy, often against the great odds and great risks. In fact, during the Pinochet era, with repression restriction on union activism, Chile's workers displayed great creativity in devising new ways to resist. Nor was this resistance confined in the workplace or workers' issue. It was Chile's workers who first raised the flag of political resistance against the dictatorship in the 1970s and sustained it during the years when political parties were banned. It was the copper miners who mobilized the social protest and political opposition to the military regime in the 1980s to demand an end to Pinochet dictatorship and the restoration of democracy and civil liberties. This confirmed by John Lair and John Cole, who noted that during the mid-1980s, unions were fundamental to organizing the national protest that led eventually to the negotiations of the 1988 plebiscite. This should be noted they always been the case. Pinochet's freedom had never been given by the people, that be but rather won by long struggle by working class people. This has always been the case, as Peter Kropotkin stressed basic political liberty were extracted from the parliament by force, by agitating that threatened to become rebellious. It was by establishing trade unions and practicing strike action despite the ethics of parliament and the hangings that workers won the right to associate and strike. In Britain, for example, to ignore that often heroic struggles show an ignorance about history, which only match an ignorance about liberty. The history of capitalism is important, and in this regard, it first developed under the absolute state, which used its power to bolster the position of the capitalist class within both national against the working class and international markets against foreign competitors. They actively interfered to create preconditions to generalize wage slavery before becoming a handicap to the rising bourgeoisie. These regimes were generally replaced by the liberal state with limited voting rights, which generally lifted the burden of state regulation for the capitalist class. The working class had to fight long and hard to win basic liberties and the vote. As Noam Chomsky noted in his book Understanding Power, such progress didn't just happen, it happened through the struggle of the labor movement and the civil rights movement and the women's movement and everything else. Its popular movement with the expanded domain of freedom of speech and other liberties until it began to be meaningful. Once these rights were won, the ruling elite had always turned to fascists to control them. Once they started to threaten their power and wealth, we see that in Germany, Italy, Japan, Spain, Portugal, Brazil, Argentina, and even the United States on multiple occasions, when push comes to shove, they will not hesitate to turn to fascism to keep their power. This obviously applies to Chile. Until the coup of September 11, Chile had been increased participants of the working class in economic and social decision making. The coup was simply a massive class revenge of the wealthy against the working class, which had dared to imagine another world was possible. Unsurprisingly, given the key role of working class people in the struggle for freedom, worker leaders and activists were central targets of the military regime state terror, whose goals was to intimidate them into passivity. In large parts of that neoliberal policy will be imposed. Equally unsurprising, those who had taken to the street aimed for political freedom in order to end the economic liberty imposed by the regime. And these right-wing libertarians, classical liberals, and anarcho-capitalist maxim that economic freedom is required to produce political liberty is deeply far position to take. Not only does it ignore the popular struggle which has always had to fight to end minority government, it also allows its advocate to justify and work with the authoritarian regime. At best, this position ensured that you would be indifferent to the destruction of political freedom as long as economic liberty, aka capitalism, was secure. At worst, it assured that you could actively support such a destruction and you could justify it in terms of return to quote-unquote democracy in the long run. The Chicago Boys spread both ends of that spectrum that can comment on the paradoxes of that economic freedom produce political freedom, but political freedom may destroy economic freedom. In the context of Chile is staggering. It was the destruction of political freedom that allowed economic freedom for the rich to impose. In reality, Chile provides evidence to the support of the alternative argument that the introduction of the free market capitalism requires the elimination or at best the reduction of political liberty. In other words, fascism was the ideal political environment to introduce economic liberty because he had destroyed political liberty. Perhaps we should conclude that the denial of political liberty is both necessary and sufficient in order to create and preserve the free market capitalism. After all, the history of capitalism has been marked by the ruling class overthrowing political liberty with their power strengthened by popular movements. As Enrico Malatesta has pointed out, capitalism can maintain struggle in the economic field so long as the workers demand small improvements, but as soon as they see their profits seriously diminish and the very existence of their privilege threatened, they appeal to the government, and if it's not sufficiently understanding and not strong enough to defend it, they will use their own wealth to finance new repressive forces and to set up new government which will serve them better. And these right-wing libertarians' argument imply that economic liberty is more important than political liberty, so making people less concerned about dictatorship as long as they support the interests of the capitalist class, while the long list of capitalists, conservatives, and right-wing classical liberals who supported fascism or fascist-like regime shows that giving them an ideological prop to justify it is unnecessary. It is hardly wise. Then there is a question whether Chile does, in fact, have genuine political liberty, aka democratic government, aka no. The answer is not quite if you talk about the liberal style of democracy. Chile's democracy is managed, one constrained both by the political legacy of Pinochet's constitution, which thankfully with the recent protest they changed it, and the threat of military intervention. Significantly, if the right-wing libertarians unconcerned about the quality of the post-Pinochet democracy Chile experienced simply put the existence of the electoral regime cannot be confused with democracy or political liberty. It is clear that Pinochet went into 1988 plebiscite expected to win, particularly as he tried to rig it like it in the 1980 election. According to many reports from the members of this cabinet and staff, he was absolutely furious and wanted to annul the results. Political backlash this would have created ensured by abide by the results. Instead, he ensured that the new government had to accept his authoritarian constitution and decree laws. In other words, knowing that he would be replaced, he immediately took steps to limit the subsequent democratically elected government as well as remain at the head of the armed forces, as because he's the one behind the coup. The, this means that the post-Pinochet Chile is not your typical democracy. Pinochet became an unelected senator for life after his retirement as Armed Force Commander in March 1998, and 28% of the Senate is designated, including 4 retired military officers named by the National Security Council. Pinochet also imposed a unique binomial electoral law in which to elect 2 deputies or senators from the same district, a party, or electoral alliance and needed to double its opponent's vote, a difficult feat, or else the opponent received an equal amount of seats in Congress. This ensured rightist control of the Senate despite the decade of majority victories by the center-left in elections. And so Pinochet's designed senator and undemocratic electoral law continued to frustrate the popular will and limits of Chile's restored democracy. The majority could not pass laws without the consent of its rightist opponents. Pinochet used final months as president to decree laws that would hamstring his opponents even if a majority of the electorate supported them. In addition, any new government was confronted with a jurisdiction and government bureaucracy backed by Pinochet with his own adherents. Moreover, the right enjoyed a near monopoly of the press and media that grew as the decade advances. Thus, Chile slumbered with Pinochet's legacy. The authoritarian constitution of 1980, which sought to create protected democracy under military indulgence, it was written so that it was difficult to amend and designed to handcuff any future opposition government and frustrate popular will. It removed the military from civilian control while subsidizing future elected governments to a military dominance. National Security Council with a vague but broad purview. Is also a banned measure against private property, with some relative minor modification of some of its most egregious features to the transition to democracy. It remained in effect for the rest of the century, and in 2004 was still Chile's fundamental charter. This constitution built upon the work of right libertarian Friedrich von Hayek and unsurprisingly aimed to insulate economic liberty from the popular pressure, i.e. to limit and reduce democracy to reduce to secure the freedom of capitalism and of course the capitalist class. In addition, the threat of military intervention is always at the forefront of political discussion. For example, on September 11, 1990, Pinochet warned that he would lead another coup if conditions is warranted. In 1993, when investigation into arms procurement scandal implicated his son, Pinochet ordered combat-ready troops and tanks onto the street for an exercise. Throughout the ensuing presidency, Pinochet maintained an army shadow cabinet that acted as a political pressure group. Unsurprisingly, the first post-Pinochet government often backed down in practice for the sake of social peace and out of fear of endangering the transition to democracy. As a result, Alwin was unable to fulfill his promise of constitutional and institutional reforms that will reverse Pinochet's authoritarian legacy. This was because the new government thought that the coup and dictatorship reflected the decision of business elites to call in the military because they could not protect their core interests under Chile's radicalized democracy. The lesson that they drew was that to avoid its repetition in the 1990s, it was necessary to reassure businesses that its interests would be protected. The limited nature of Chile's democracy was seen in 1998 when Pinochet was arrested in Britain in regard of a warrant issued by the Spanish judge for the murder of Spanish citizens during his regime. Commentators, particularly those of the right, stressed that Pinochet's arrest could undermine Chile's fragile democracy by provoking military. In other words, Chile is only a democracy insofar as the military let it be. Of course, few commentators acknowledged the fact that this meant that Chile was not in fact democracy after all, all which explained why subsequent government had only tinkered with the free market policy introduced by Pinochet. They had dared to reverse them not due to their popular nature, but to the obvious fact that recent Chilean history showed that progressive politicians and their supporters had something to fear besides losing an election. Unsurprisingly, workers' social-economic aspirations were postponed in interest of a new jeopardizing and transition, and the expectation of labor, laws, and reforms were sacrificed on the same altar. While 2002 saw the election of the first socialist president since Allende, it is unlikely Chile will experience anything beyond minor reforms. The legacy of fear and political restriction will ensure that the ruling class will have little to fear from political freedom being used by politicians to curb their power and wealth. Then there is the social legacy of 70 years of dictatorship, as one expert in Latin America, K. Discussion noted in 1993. Transformation of the economic and political system under Pinochet has had a profound impact on the worldview of the typical Chilean. With most having little contact with other workers or with their neighbors, and only limited time with their family, their exposure to political or labor organizations is minimal. They lack either the political resource or the disposition to confront the nature. The fragmented opposition communities had accomplished what brute military repression could not. It was transformed Chile, but culturally and politically, from a country of active participation grassroots communities to a land of disconnected apolitical individuals. The cumulative impact of this charge is such that they are unlikely to see any concern challenging to the current ideology in the near future. In such circumstances, political liberty can be reintroduced as no one in a position to actively use it. In addition, Chileans live with the memory that challenging the state is the near past result in the fascist dictatorship murdering thousands of people, as well as repeat and persistent violation of human rights by the junta, not to mention the existence of anti-Marxist death squads. For example, in 1986, Amnesty International accused the Chilean government of employing death squads. According to human rights group, the Pinochet regime was responsible for 11,536 human rights violations between 1984 to 1988 alone. These facts that will have a strongly deterrent effect on people contemplating the use of political liberty to actually change the status quo in the ways the military and economic elites do not approve of. This does not mean, of course, that the Chilean people are resisting oppression and exploitation and rebuilding their organization. Simply they are using free speech, striking, and other forms of social action is more difficult. This protest and increase the power, wealth, and authority and the employer and the state over the wage slave goes without stating. It was it was what was intended, as Peter Kropotkin pointed out years ago. If the freedom of press and all of the rest are only respected if the people do not make use of them against the previous classes. But the days of the people begin to take advantage of them to undermine those privileges, then the so-called liberties will be cast overboard. Chile is a classic example of this, a bloody example which helped detect genuine democracy in the country decades later. And it was thanks to the anarchists and the anarchist philosophy that brought back democracy in Chile. 6 years after the 1973 coup d'etat, the anarchists and other left libertarians began to reorganize. An umbrella group called the Socialist Ideas and Action, or the PSA, was formed, bringing together anarchists and left-wing libertarian-leaning members of the former Popular Unity Coalition. Anarchists were involved in the struggle against the dictatorship in the 1980s with the return of democracy in the 1990s when anarchist group formed, disappeared, and regrouped.